Thank you so much for having me. It's really so exciting that you guys are doing a course like this and sharing such important topics. And it's really nice to be invited to come and talk about some of my research. And if you're lucky, you just might get to hear a few cows mooing in the background because I can just see they're coming up by my window. So just to add a little bit more excitement to my talk. Thank you so much for the introduction, Lynn. As it was mentioned, I am in the middle of my PhD. So I'm in towards the end of my second year, just wrapping up my data gathering phase. So I haven't got too much analysis to share with you, but I can certainly tell you what I've done so far, which really talks about open publishing in the context of higher education textbooks. So I am specifically looking at the creation and adaption of open textbooks and how they can be yet better used to support human progress and development through broader access to education. And I'm particularly interested in how open publishing models work in the context of higher education, drawing on some of the dominant open textbook publishing models in higher ed. I use the information that has been produced before me, especially in some of the areas in the US, in Canada, in the UK, where they have a really progressive open textbook movement. And I look at some of these dominant models and I'm assessing in conjunction with doing some qualitative research interviews with stakeholders to analyse the circumstances in which these open publishing models are most effective, efficient, and essentially how they compare to each other. So I'll talk a little bit about my process and I guess the why, because that's the most important thing. Why would I do something like this for research? So as I said, I'm looking at how publishing works. And when I'm talking about how something works, I'm looking at a couple of specific parts of the operation of open textbooks. I'm focusing on economically how they work, how sustainable open textbooks are, looking at the various types of funding models that are available. But I'm also really interested in a concept which is called human flourishing. And I will discuss that in a little bit more detail so we have a better understanding of what I mean when I talk about human flourishing. But the overall goal of my research is twofold. So first, I'm doing this research because I want to provide a template for Australian stakeholders in higher ed. I want to help them choose between models of open publishing. I want to make it easier to support, fund, create, adopt open textbooks in the Australian publishing ecosystem. Because I know of so many people in Australia who are trying to do such great work in this area, but there really is a bit of a gap in how we can get some better funding, some better government support, and some better institutional support. So that's my first reason I'm doing this research. The second is that the outcomes of this research could potentially assist stakeholders in understanding the value associated with providing barrier-free access to education. And when I talk about this value, I'm talking about a potential to address some higher issues, those which are involved in the Sustainable Development Goals and in general in supporting human development. So I'm considering the perspectives of 4 key stakeholders. I consider these people to be the individuals involved, the philanthropic funders and the private funders, the institutions, which are the educational institutions, and the government. And in order to essentially be able to provide this roadmap for these stakeholders, I need to address 2 questions. And my research questions are looking at essentially how these publishing models work, when they work, and why they work. What are the values, the motivations, and the barriers involved when choosing between particular models? And then I'm going to rank them in terms of, well, how well do they actually support human development? And when I'm talking about the human development, again, I'm talking more about equitable access to content, because not all access is equal access. So I'm going to just give you a little bit of an overview about what I think open publishing is and what supports my research. So an open publishing model in open textbooks, I'm looking at models which support the dissemination of education and knowledge goods in an unrestricted way. Access to knowledge is not restricted by physical access or by financial access or by digital rights management. And there are varying levels of access in terms of open publishing. We're looking at how open and accessible something is, how reusable that knowledge can be, and how equitable that access is. So when I'm talking about equity, I'm looking at David Wiley's 5 R's of open. Can this content be reused, retained, redistributed, remixed, and revised? If something can do all of those 5 things, they're going to rank higher on a system which is looking at supporting human development. So when we look at questions of equity, we need to consider who can access this. What are the barriers? How is that access happening? Does it require certain things in order to allow this access to occur, such as a cost? Do you need data? Do you need a certain level of internet speed? Is there a language requirement that hasn't been considered? Is there a disability access requirement that we don't know about? If access to education and knowledge was more equitable, more people would have access and reuse capabilities, which would in turn help support their learning and their development. Humans would be provided more opportunities in general to flourish and to fulfill their potential through learning and creating. Open publishing provides an opportunity for educational content such as textbooks to be published openly and distributed broadly for reuse. And this opportunity provides a further, much larger opportunity to address more systemic issues and global concerns. These global concerns include equitable access, sustainable development, and the development of humans in general. And I'm going to touch on some of these in more detail. As you would know, open textbooks is just one form of open education resources, with open education resources being the broader term used. For my research, I am focusing on open textbooks, but it's important for us to get on the same page about what we mean by OER, open education resources. So open education resources aim to remove access barriers which restrict access to knowledge. They encourage and promote sharing and remixing. They make it easier to adapt content into other languages and assist with creating accessible content. They support disability access through sharing and adapting, and they support the creation of localized versions of content by permitting sharing, reuse, remix, and redistribution. Open textbooks are the textbooks which are published openly and licensed in a way which allow users to use and reuse the content. And as I said before, there are varying levels of accessibility in open textbooks. On one end of the open textbook accessibility scale, we have textbooks that are available just for access for free. And on the other end, we have textbooks that are not only available for access, but you can do the whole 5 R's with them. You can reuse them, you can remix them, you can redistribute them, you can revise them. So we need to ask, why is it so important for us to consider open education and equitable access to knowledge? And it's important because of a number of things. Open access in general has been a hot topic for some time, well beyond when I started embarking on my research career. But the notion of providing equitable access is not quite as old. Human flourishing theory proposes that in order for humans to develop to their full potential, they need to access a number of what is called fundamental requirements. And one of these is the fundamental requirement to access education. And as I noted earlier, all access is not created equal. And this means that some form of access may not be as equitable as others. And this is really important. As you can see from the slide deck, oh, sorry, I must have forgot. I'm behind on my slides. Here we go, sorry. So as you can see in the access section, there are a number of fundamental requirements that humans need. So things like good health, political liberties, social powers, and encouragement. But today I'm just going to focus on the one that is most relevant to open education resources, which is access to education and knowledge. And we do know that this is a global issue. And we know this because there is currently some sustainable development goals which are created by the United Nations that tell us some of the fundamental issues of the world. And number 4 is quality education. There's also a sustainable development agenda which sets out the agenda of how the nation collectively can try and achieve each of these goals. These goals include addressing poverty, solving world hunger, producing sustainable clean water, addressing climate change concerns, and providing access to education. And as you can see, there's 17 of them, so there's quite a number of goals that we have to collectively try and achieve. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development was a result of the United Nations Summit, which was held in September 2015. At this summit, world leaders came together and discussed what they needed to do over the next 15 years as a whole to take steps to actively progress and hopefully find solutions to these issues. An important aspect of the Sustainable Development Agenda is that collectively the nations will work towards progress to ensure not one nation is left behind. Equity, not just equality. These goals form a roadmap for global development efforts leading into 2030. So Sustainable Development Goal number 4 is quality education. Ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. This goal highlights the current issue with respect to access to education on a global level. There is approximately 103 million youth worldwide who do not have basic literacy skills. The issue of access is more prominent for women, who make up more than 60% of that figure. And this issue is further exacerbated in developing countries, where approximately 57 million children remain out of school. Access to education is a clear issue, and more prominently, there is no equity in the access that is afforded globally. Some countries have much greater access to knowledge, and some countries need more assistance to enable access than others. So how does open publishing and open education of textbooks fit into this picture? So on a very basic level, if open education resources, and specifically textbooks, were more readily adopted, access to knowledge and education would be more inclusive and equitable. That's just simply by allowing content to reach places it might not have reached before. And a very specific example of this is that a textbook is free. It's generally available in multiple formats, some of which are tailored to specific devices such as mobile phone access, and has the ability to be shared, remixed, and revised. There is potential for more people to access the content. In this sense, open education resources, and specifically open textbooks, have the potential to be a vehicle to progress the Sustainable Development Goal, number 4, just in terms of providing access to educational content. But on a more complex level, there is another way that open textbooks and open education resources can generally be used to progress the Sustainable Development Goals, all of them, and promote human flourishing. Open education resources can be used to progress Sustainable Development Goals in general through the values and ideas that underpin creation and dissemination of open education content. So we're looking at open pedagogy, open learning. Academics, researchers, librarians, administrators, developers, and creators create open education resources. I create them, and I'm sure many of you have created them. They can be created by anyone, anywhere, and that makes them special. SDG information, education, and research could be incorporated into the textbooks, into the teaching, into the course design, and there are significant benefits of this. So in the US, higher education system, students spend approximately 40 million hours on what David Wiley classifies as disposable assignments, and this is annually. Green suggests that instead of setting these disposable assignments through the use of open education resources and through open pedagogy, educators could set assignments that target sustainable development goals, allowing students to think about solutions to real-world problems. And in that, in itself, exists the potential for 40 million hours a year to be spent by students thinking about sustainable development and solutions. The Sustainable Development Goals are issues which all of the nations of the world agree were problems which would significantly impact our future. And there is an opportunity to explore the ways that open publishing could be used to play a more active role in addressing some of these issues by providing the infrastructure and support to education, teaching, and learning. So in a nutshell, there is a significant value in being able to access beyond just helping those students who we can see face to face. It provides access to a broader community of people, some of which we can't even imagine would be accessing content. These open education resources allow people to access, adapt, reuse, and share knowledge. And this in itself is a more equitable model of access compared to traditional publishing models. These resources, which could incorporate sustainable development issues, aim to increase the knowledge and understanding. They allow a bigger amount of people to actively think about solving issues. And this goes towards addressing the Sustainable Development Goals as a whole. All of these are positive things which relate to access, which can help provide opportunities for more people to learn, which is good for both equity, equality to access, or access to knowledge and education. So essentially, if more people are afforded access to knowledge, more people will have the opportunity to progress to their full potential, which helps address the issue of human flourishing, that fundamental requirement people need in order to progress. And so I'll briefly talk about some of the things I've found out so far. So there's been a lot of studies on open education resources. Nothing too specific about open textbook models, although this is starting to be an emerging area of research. So some of the most notable which I use were the ones I've listed here, which is Downs, de Langdon, and Okoli and Wang. They all have very different ways that they categorize the different types of open education resource models. What I've done is I have read quite widely And I've looked at some of the similarities and differences between these open education resource models, and I've applied the relevant aspects to what I'm calling the open textbook models. And I'm using the work of Chris Anderson in his book, Free: The Future of a Radical Price. He writes more from an economic perspective, but talks about how free is the new model. And with open textbooks, one of the most important things is that the textbook is free. So I'm using Anderson's models, which he has 4, and it's the non-monetary market model, the freemium model, the three-party market, and the direct cost subsidiaries model. And I'm going to explain what each of those are and then give some examples about how these fit into the open textbook model ecosystem. So non-monetary market models, these focus more on giving away content for free. So it's not so much about where the money comes from and who's accessing the content, but a blanket, this content is being given away for free. These models often operate under the premise that there is no expectation of payment in return to providing for the content to be accessed. And in these particular models, there are 3 subcategories known as the gift economy, labor exchange, and piracy. So some examples which exist in the publishing of textbooks ecosystem is the donations and grants model. So the donation and grants model involves open textbooks that are created by way of a foundational grant from, it could be from any particular donor or grant, but it involves most likely a one-off or only a limited source of funding. These models rely on the funding to be subsidized usually by a private funder. Sometimes it can be funded by an institution, but the important aspect of this is that it is reliant on the funding of an external source. Another model which is very similar to this is the governmental or foundational sponsorship model. This is also reliant on the external funding, but the program is usually directly administered or primarily funded by a government agency or a well-established philanthropic funding organisation. And what sets this apart from donations and grants models is that the funding is often more sustainable, particularly when we're looking at government funding, because governments usually set up their budgets to carry on similar funding unless something is cut. So this one, the government or sponsorship funding model is very similar to donation and grants model, but there is a very big difference in terms of the sustainability. The last model we're looking at in non-monetary market models is the prosumer community models. And this is one of the most popular models to produce open textbooks. What makes it a prosumer model is that the person who creates the content is often also a consumer of the content. And so a good example of this is a teacher who creates a textbook off their own back without any funding or real support from any external organisation or from the educational institution. They're using it in their course because they either found a gap in the current content that they were using, or they wanted to deliver the content in a different way to benefit their students. And another example which is really popular with this one is like a wiki-based type of resource, because wiki it's free. You can either choose to completely engage in the content as just a user, or you can also contribute and use the content. The second model I'm going to look at is the freemium model. This model focuses on providing one product for free, but it's also matched with a premium paid version of a product. The idea is that the free product entices users, and in the instance of textbooks, it's the educational institutions usually, or sometimes it's students directly, to upgrade to a paid version of a product. It's the idea of incentivizing one thing in order to gain another. This particular model is used in online programs of traditional institutions, which usually is where there is a traditional institution which is offering a free face-to-face course or a free face-to-face textbook, and the students have to either pay to enroll in the course or pay something to access another aspect of the course. So it's another variation of the different types of models, but this one has been particularly popular for Harvard University. Has done a lot of free courses, and I've adapted it to suit more the idea of the free textbook with a paid course, which is something which a few universities are starting to trial. The next model, which I don't actually have up there, is the selling course experience model, which is very similar to the online program of traditional institution. But this is looking specifically at the course being free, and one aspect of the textbook is free, but then students have to pay to access another aspect of the educational experience, such as, say, the schedule or feedback on assessments. So it's looking at monetizing one aspect in order to give away something else. The other model I'm looking at is the three-party market model, and this model is commonly used. It's the most common model used in general free economies, but it is not the most common model used in open textbook markets. So the most prime example of this type of model is an advertising model. So for instance, if this was to be used in a textbook, it would have an open textbook that had advertising throughout the textbook, which would subsidize the cost of creation in the hopes that the students accessing the textbook would then purchase the products being advertised. This model has been criticized in the past for luring consumers into buying things that they may not want. And some of the criticisms I have of this particular model being used in the open textbook market is that it may not be ethical for students to have to be exploited through the process of accessing content. And it's certainly not going to rank very highly in terms of a human flourishing theory model. So that's something interesting about that particular model. And the last one is the direct cross-subsidiaries model. This is the model which embodies the catchphrase, "There's no such thing as a free lunch." So this focuses on using a paid product to subsidize a free product. An example of this is the Cooperative Production Consortium. So this involves a consortium model of a large-scale community of educational institutions who partner with a provider to create and disseminate content. So they're essentially banding together to create content, but the actual fees for the university are still on the students. So students need to be enrolled to be able to access this particular benefits of this system. Same with the institutional subscription model. The university libraries pay for subscriptions. Students don't seem to notice that they're paying for things, but in the end, they're accessing it by way of being enrolled in a university course, and then the universities are able to use some sum to be able to put towards their library funding to be able to purchase institutional subscriptions. The last one, which is one that I'm very fascinated with, which is the pay what you want model. So it's important to note with the pay what you want model, the creator usually sets a price that they think is fair and reasonable for this particular item. So for instance, if it was a textbook, they would set a price, say $30 for a textbook. They would then say to the students, you can access this textbook for free. There is no DRM, digital rights management, but you can also access it. You can free ride, or you can pay anything up into the amount that I've set. And this is a really popular model. There is quite a big company in America called Semaphore Press who have been trialing this model for a number of years. And it's popular. They do mostly, I think it's mostly law, but I think they've also done a marketing textbook. And essentially they're finding that while some students will free ride, the majority of students are actually paying at least something to access the textbook. And so these students are seeing the benefit that these teachers are giving them by giving them a low-cost textbook, which is still of high quality, but they're accounting for those who do want a free ride by still making the price a little above what it could be. So that is a really interesting model which is emerging. It certainly beats paying the $150 to $250 you might pay for a casebook. But certainly there's a lot of analysis that needs to happen in terms of looking at these. I have interviewed stakeholders in each of these different models, and I'm hoping to have my findings from that released mid next year. I still have a few more stakeholders I need to interview. But my general conclusions on the textbook model is that essentially the things we need to think about in order to have a successful model is economic efficiency, sustainability, both in terms of creating content but funding. So not just the money, but also can we sustainably update this content and maintain it? The scalability, a lot of small scale projects seem to work well, but it fails at the scalability component. And it has to be able to be implemented by stakeholders. And that's something that we seem to struggle with in Australia because we seem to have people interested in doing this kind of work, but not a lot of high level support. And that's something that I'm hoping my research can try and address. So I'm hoping to better understand signaling and payoffs involved in each of the models, getting a better understanding of why stakeholders are making decisions, and then I'll be able to say exactly why these models are in a better position to work and when they might not be. So as I mentioned, I have undertaken interviews. I'm still sort of towards the end of my research interviews. What I was looking for with these research interviews was to talk to people in the stakeholder groups, use semi-structured interview questions on open publishing, and find out their motivations, their values, what made them choose that particular project, what decisions were made in that project, were there particular barriers or trade-offs associated when using a particular type of model. I'm also looking at what types of outputs they're using. What level of access are they affording? Have they considered disability access? Is that something that they couldn't do but they want to do in the future? These are the types of things that we need to better understand to be able to successfully implement open textbooks at a larger scale in Australia. So I've interviewed textbook creators, textbook users, publishers, funders, and those working in institutions on open textbooks. Their experiences have told me that there are some serious problems that we need to address that have occurred quite widely in North America and in the UK. Things that we can learn from that they've encountered that maybe we could try and avoid doing here in Australia. But as I said, I'm still in the final stages of my research. I still have a handful of interviews to conduct, both in Australia, a couple from the UK, and I'm also still recruiting. So if anyone's interested in talking to me about an open textbook project, I'm all ears. I love to hear experiences of people. So, but I will be able to share with you some of the questions that I ask them, and that might give you some insight into perhaps some of the questions that you might have in this particular area. So I'm interested in talking to people about the different types of projects, about where their funding has come from, what their objective was, and did that have to change during the project? A lot of the time I've been talking to people who are creating small-scale projects and they had big dreams in the beginning, but barriers such as institutional support, licensing, being able to license content that they use for teaching currently has been a big problem for creators in Australia because we have quite strict copyright laws. In my past life, I was a lawyer, so I'm quite familiar with some of these, but it was really interesting to hear it from a creative perspective and seeing just how much those barriers are stopping some progress from occurring here in our own backyards. I'm really interested to talk about where they see the project going. Is it a one-off project or was there potential development over a 5-year plan? These are all the sorts of questions that I asked a lot of my stakeholders. These were the general questions, and for each stakeholder group, I had specific questions relating to their area of work. And I really can't wait to share those findings. I wish I had more of the analysis done for you, but I've just got back from my month-long research trip in the US, so I'm still frantically going through all of my notes and findings to make them all coherent. But the next phase of my research was an in-depth case study, and this I've been working on for the duration of my PhD. This is a case study which involves an intellectual property law textbook, which has been created at QUT. It's been taught for the last 5 years, and it will continue to be taught in the subject. There is no other prescribed textbook. This is it. It's free to access for students. It's hosted on a Wikipedia, a Wikijuris, so students get to access the content there. It can also be downloaded. It is licensed under a Creative Commons CC by Share Alike license, which means that anyone who accesses it, and it can be accessed by anyone, not just students, they're able to reuse, retain, redistribute, revise, and remix the content, so long as they abide by the requirements of the license, which means it also needs to be Share Alike. This content has been going through quite a heavy editing phase, which has been part of the project. I've been talking to students. I've been looking at surveys from past use of the textbook to work out where we need to improve it and to implement some of the comments that students have made previously. One of the things which is really quite cool about this textbook is that the next slide is a picture of the front page of the textbook. So you can see it's quite simple. It's not a replacement for a traditional textbook. It is a new way to envisage what textbooks could be. So it involves content, it involves like written content, it has video content, and there are link outs. You get directed to different sites. It's quite interactive. It can also be downloaded, but we are currently working on making sure that we can download it in multiple outputs. So that's something that the team is working on. This book was created by Associate Professor Nicholas Souza. He's also the project lead, and it's a project that I'm working on both for my PhD, but it's also, I work on it as a research assistant. So I've been working with this IP law team for the last 2 years. Associate Professor Souza created this textbook because he didn't like the idea that students had to pay such a high price to access content. He also wanted to ensure that there was a wider opportunity to access content, and he liked the idea that students could collaborate on this particular textbook and that it could be easily updated and changed. So this course that this new textbook is used for also has an assessment item which requires students to create a short video on an area of IP law. So this could be on a specific area, say copyright duration, or it could be a video overview of a case. And this particular textbook is now filled with past students' video examples. And so we like to really encourage students to use the wiki. We encourage them to make edits to the wiki, and all students are allowed to edit the Wikipedia. They have access to it, and they can do any changes they want and add content. There is a short video explainer, but I don't think I quite have time to show you it. But if you are interested more about the open textbook, I'll put the link in the comments after this, and you can have a look. But this is a video explainer directed mostly at students and teachers about why Associate Professor Souza chose open textbooks and some of the benefits, and also how to contribute. So that is a really valuable project that I have been working on, and I'm using it as a case study to really work out how a certain model of open textbooks operates. This particular textbook, I should mention, is an example of the non-monetary market model of publishing, and it's a gift economy. So it is in its most purest form, something that we as a team have chosen to give away for free with no hope of getting any return back. It's just a gift to students and really to the public. Well, hopefully it'll be a gift. Hopefully they'll think it's a gift. We do. So a roadmap for Australian stakeholders. This is what I'm trying to achieve. I really want to be able to guide Australian stakeholders to do what they want to do with open textbooks to progress the movement. The momentum in other jurisdictions has really grown, and Australia needs to catch up to be able to get the same benefits, and also to get other benefits, such as I mentioned, the benefits of being able to progress human development, to be able to look more broadly beyond the traditional publishing models and think about these alternative models as something which is achievable and sustainable. So for me, there exists an opportunity for innovation and progress through the broader adoption of open publishing, not just for textbooks, but in open education in general. And we need to better understand how these models work so we can really harness that opportunity, and so we can guide these decision makers on how, when, and what model best suits their needs and best suits the people they're publishing for. Essentially, broader adoption of open education resources has significant potential to be able to affect real change in the world. And I'm hoping that if we can really harness it, we might be able to help achieve some of the sustainable development goals and be able to improve access globally. And of course, open publishing isn't the only thing that needs to change. There are other things that need to work in conjunction with this to be able to broaden access to education. But this is just one small way that we can try and make a difference. So the outcomes of this research could have significant impact. And looking locally, if we can guide stakeholders to invest time and money into things like textbooks, which are truly providing equitable access to knowledge and education, this type of investment would be so important for countries such as Australia that don't currently have state and government support. If we can get state and federal support for things like creating open content, then we're going to be able to work more towards achieving these human development goals. So I think this research space is pretty interesting, but there's so much work that still needs to be done. And I think that open publishing is really changing the way knowledge in general is accessed and used. It's providing alternative ways to publish knowledge by removing access barriers. It promotes equitable free access, and it supports changes in social norms and trends. Essentially, it's letting people do and use content the way they want to. So there is an opportunity to progress through the broader adoption of open publishing and not just textbooks. And this broader adoption has the potential to make real changes to significant issues, such as those included in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and more broadly with respect to human development. And this is one of my favorite quotes that I use frequently because it really, I think, really tells a lot about the importance of knowledge, because that's what it all comes down to, is being able to give people access to knowledge and education. So knowledge is cumulative. With ideas, the cumulative effect is a public good, so long as people have access to the vast storehouse. An infinite amount of knowledge is waiting to be unearthed. The discovery of future knowledge is a commons good and a treasure we owe to future generations. The challenge of today's generation is to keep the pathways to discovery open. And I see that as a vehicle for open publishing. So that is essentially what I'm looking at for my research. And if anyone has, I see we've got a bunch of questions, so that's exciting.
Great, thanks, Jessica.